every time there's a crackdown or, they grab the big guy, someone else comes up out of the woodworks. I mean, right now, something that we're not seeing as much, we're not talking about is the fact that the Sinaloa cartel, which since the infighting began between the two factions of that cartel on September 9th, that cartel has been struggling. And there's another cartel called the Jalisco New Generation Cartel,
Yep.
which right now, is operating so under the radar. I mean, I give it 2 years, maybe max, and they're just gonna be like the cartel.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. Today's episode is going to center around the cartels. And my guest today is Katarina Szulc. Her work as a journalist reporting on Mexican cartels, the rise of digital arms trading through encrypted platforms, and the latest developments in the U.S.-Mexico anti-cartel efforts are in near real time because she lives in Mexico City. She is a Canadian investigative journalist based in Mexico, known for her in-depth reporting on issues related to security, organized crime, and drug trade. Her work often takes her into dangerous and high-risk areas where she investigates the inner workings of criminal organizations, the impact of drug violence, and the challenges faced by law enforcement and government agencies in the area. Let's dive in. We got to start somewhere. How did you find yourself in Mexico City? And also, where in Canada are you from?
I'm from Vancouver, West Coast, Best Coast.
The Couve. I've been there many times. I live in Kalispell, Montana, so the northwestern corner. Alberta's just due north of us, but I've been over to Vancouver a ton.
And I lived in Alberta for a year. I lived in Edmonton for work
Okay.
when I worked at CBC. But yeah, I came to Mexico 2 years ago because I've always been interested in the stories here. I The reason I got into journalism was because most of my role models, like heroine journalists, were actually Mexican women. And I always wanted to do international news. Like I've always wanted to be a foreign correspondent since I was a kid. So
Really?
because I speak Spanish and because of the proximity of Mexico to Canada, I just figured, and my understanding of the context here, I figured that it would just work out.
What is a heroin journalist? Is that exactly what it sounds like? Somebody who studies and works in heroin?
No, like a
Oh,
heroine.
I know what you're saying. Okay, I'm like, are we talking like injectable here? I mean, I'm like, my God, I've been to Skid Row in Vancouver, but what a weird.
No,
Okay.
no. Yeah, the women that I looked up to that I thought were
Okay.
really fearless and strong journalists. Yeah.
I know the heroin you're talking about now. Yeah, different spelling and activity completely. I
Yeah,
think.
there's an E at the end.
Yeah. Okay. So since you were a little kid, you wanted to get into that type of journalism.
Yeah.
Where do you think you would have landed? Say that the cartels aren't what they are. Do you have any idea where you would have landed? What type of journalism you would have been doing outside of cartels? Or do you think it would have just been what struck you at that time?
I probably would have went to the Middle East because like that after the Arab Spring, and I was really young when that happened. I followed that news a lot. I remember watching a lot of reporting about Syria when the war first broke out, and I think I was in like fourth grade, and I was following that heavily. And I've always also been very um, in love with Arab culture, and
Mhm.
I love Arabic. I speak Arabic. I took lessons, and it's yeah that's probably where I would have ended up. It just probably would have been more challenging in terms of I'm a woman. I am not from that region. I don't have like any connections to it, so it would have been a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, different continent, a lot more travel. That definitely would have been culture a little bit harder, I think, for you to get. embedded or to have the level of access that you do. So the desire to cover the cartels is one thing. Ending up living in Mexico City in the trenches, metaphorically, is totally a different thing. And I'm just curious how you were able to actually take that desire and dream that you wanted to do and make it into a reality.
Well, I never would have just covered this from home. Like
Yeah.
for me, the way that I cover stories, and I've always felt that the best journalists are those that are literally boots on the ground. Like you have to talk to the people, you have to experience it. And I get a lot of comments from people thinking that I've never been to Mexico, I don't live in Mexico, people think I don't speak Spanish. But the reality is that I'm totally boots on the ground. In fact, uh, almost to an extreme extent in comparison to some of the other journalists that are covering the cartels. Like, of course, there are some who are certainly who are here and they're going to the regions, but a lot of them cannot do that for safety reasons, and so they're in the United States, or they don't really go into the regions where there is a lot of conflict. But for me, I had to do that. That was a total non-negotiable, uh, in spite of the extreme violence and risk that I may be taking. I don't really give a fuck, because you have to be there in order to tell these stories accurately and to know exactly what's going on. And a lot of my reporting involves telling stories that go beyond the headlines. Who are those that are affected? What does the region look like? What are the socioeconomic impacts? And I can't do that from home. That's not something that you just type into Chat GPT or look at on Twitter or Facebook, or talk to people over Zoom calls. I feel like it defeats the whole purpose of telling a thorough story. So I really just dove in head first, honestly. And looking back, there were a lot of things that I would have done differently, but I was, well, still am young and to a certain degree naive and very passionate. That is something that can never be taken away. So I just decided, okay, one day when I was working at a news station, I need to go and pursue this. And there were so many stories that were coming up at this time, and it was right before the Mexican election. And so I literally just came over.
How do you manage the risk interfacing at such a proximity to the cartels? I know you've had direct conversations with people involved with, aligned with the cartels. Like you said, you're going to areas that a lot of people wouldn't. Is there any true way to actually mitigate all of the risk? And I mean, what kind of steps do you have along? Do you ever worry for your safety given the topic that you're covering and the organizations that you're covering?
Certainly. I really appreciate it, but I do get some comments of people being like fearless journalists, and that is not the case. I am fearful and I do get scared. And the ways that I mitigate the risks, uh, you know, I try to use common sense a lot. And I try to be really aware of my surroundings and who I'm associating with and what I'm doing. And I'm a very paranoid person these days. Since yeah, since I started covering this beat, I have become a paranoid person.
Yeah, I bet.
And yeah, and I mean, I think it's warranted. Um, but at the end of the day, if somebody wants to do something to me, or something's going to happen, or I'm at the wrong place at the wrong time, or for some reason a target ends up on my back for some shit that I say, because as we know, like, I just can't zip it. Um, it's gonna happen. I mean, I understand the risks associated with this. I'm not fearless. I try not to be naive. I don't think I am, because I understand the risks. I just uh kind of have the balls to just go and do it, because I think that telling these stories is more important uh than staying silent. And it's so rewarding for a lot of the communities to have someone who is just completely willing to go and do this and have their voices heard and help them give a platform to the stories that they have to tell. So it's a little complicated. I mean, people ask me this a lot. What are the exact precautions that you take to be safe? First of all, I would never say that on a public forum.
Yeah, probably
Second
not a
of
good
all,
idea.
no. And second of all, it's really not as complicated as you think. And at the end of the day, if shit really were to hit the fan, uh, any of the precautions I take would just go right out the window.
Have
Probably.
you? Do you think you've had any close calls, or do you have you had any that you're aware of?
Of course, yeah. Yeah. But you know what? Those close calls, they kind of make you smarter in terms of how I navigate this. Uh, but for example, you know, most recently, uh, I went to the border. I was talking to some people in organized crime. I did a YouTube video about it to kind of get their reactions to the FTO designation.
Hmm.
And I went by myself. And that's another thing too. Obviously not smart, do not recommend it, but I am a freelance journalist and sometimes it's just I just have to go and I don't have a team. So I'm at this house with these nefarious people. We're doing our interviews, and it just so happens that the Mexican military shows up. Now, thankfully, I had met with these people before. Uh, I felt a sense of security with them in a way that they're not going to do anything to me. They're willing to tell me their story, and they respect me as a journalist, and they know what I'm doing. So there should be no surprises. Well, surprise, the military shows up. And, you know, I don't want to say I was lucky or anything, but I think that if I hadn't met with these people before, if we didn't have built some sort of rapport and them also trust me to know that I posted about them anonymously before,
Hmm.
I mean, they could have been like, you set us up. What are they doing here? What the fuck? And especially in the area that we were, it just was so weird for so much of the Marina, the I think Marines in English,
Probably, yeah.
or the Navy, to show up. So, and it was a very tense situation. I try not to harp on this, especially in my reporting, because the story is not about me, right? It's about we're getting their reactions, and this is just something on the side that ended up happening. Uh, but yeah, that was something that could have been bad if it wasn't me, if I didn't know these people, or if the Marina actually like really went hard on them while I was there.
You know, you mentioned something I was going to ask you about, and that's the FTO designation. It's
Hmm.
been talked about a lot, obviously, north of the border. I'm curious how it's been received by people on the ground, and specifically people aligned with or adjacent to the cartel south of the border. Do they care? Do they understand what it means and any of the permissions or authorities that may change? I'm just curious their thoughts on it.
Okay, so this is really complicated because publicly people have been saying, people with connections to the cartel or in the cartels, the people I interviewed or the Noreste cartel that posted a video with their reaction, and in certain group chats are saying, it's no big deal, nothing's going to happen, it is what it is, right? And that's very interesting because then people who are kind of lower down on the food chain don't have that same reaction. And of course, because they're worried that
Hmm.
it's going to affect their power and their money. Because if the upper heads are saying, we're just going to lay low, we're going to wait it out for Trump's administration, we're going to cool it with the human smuggling, the fentanyl trafficking, well, who's most impacted by that economically, right? The people at the bottom, the drug runners, the people who are trafficking, the people who are in charge of those sort of monotonous tasks that the uppers who are making the most, profiting the most off of this, are not doing and are not responsible for. So there's, of course, a mixed reaction just because there are so many levels of positions of power within the cartel. I mean, I say this all the time, but the cartels operate like a Fortune 500. It's a booming business, and they have all their checks and balances in place in order to ensure that it runs like a business, right? And they're making as much money as possible. And it's important to keep in mind that the cartel employs a significant percentage of people in Mexico. And a lot of people are profiting off of organized crime here and the cartels. Of course, on the other side, a lot of people are suffering because a lot of people are murdered, kidnapped, victims of violence, you name it. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of people profiting. And so I think the scariest part of the FTO designation that perhaps a lot of people don't understand, it's not oh, there's going to be drone strikes across the border and stuff like that. It's the fact that this is going to affect money, because the main action that can be taken with the FTO designation is freezing assets. And I mean, as we've seen in movies and we've seen historically, when criminals feel that their money is being affected negatively, of course, that's when all hell breaks loose, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that across the board right now, there isn't a sense of panic within the criminal organizations. What I can say, though, for regular civilians in Mexico, a lot of people, when they heard about this and heard that Trump was cracking down on the cartels, it was like, hell yeah, finally, let's put an end to it. Someone is finally coming in here and standing up to these guys who are wreaking havoc across our country. And there are videos of public shootouts, students running and trying to dodge bullets, and some random old lady lets them into her house to keep them in safety. I mean, there is no level of normalcy in a lot of these regions where the cartels have a lot of power, are fighting for power, and are putting on very public displays of extreme violence. But yeah, it's different. And I here's the thing too. I think it's going to change. I mean, this is a constantly adapting situation. I feel like almost every time I'm on a podcast or I'm talking about this publicly, something changes week after week. And that's because, of course, Trump's actions are changing. The Mexican government policy is changing. We're in a state of flux. And so it'll be really hard to say what could happen in the coming months. I don't know, and I don't want to speculate because it could be so unexpected. I mean, you have three major figures at plays, two of the governments, America, the United and Mexico, and then the cartels.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard me talk about Firecracker Farm and their hot salt. You probably heard other people talk about it as well. If you haven't tried it yet, let me just tell you, you're missing out on some serious flavor. Their hot salt is delicious, and it really makes pretty much anything that you put it on even more delicious. It's hot, but when you use it in moderation, it's not too hot, and the flavor that it adds enhances without overpowering. It is handmade, super premium, and comes in awesome stainless steel push-button grinders like the one I have in my hand right here. You can take them anywhere. Hot sauce, if you've had this experience, can very easily overpower other flavors and always runs out quickly when it's good. Hot salt lasts and lasts. The push grinder holds over 500 plus pumps, and when you consider the refill it comes with, it's thousands of servings, and it's a great deal and a lot cheaper than the sauce. For those of you that like flavor but hesitate because it might be too hot, you can mix it with sea salt to tone it down and still enjoy the awesome flavor. In my personal experience, you can modulate how much comes out of the dispenser. You're in total control of the amount of heat you serve yourself. So if you would like to support our show and give Alex and his family business a shot, head over to firecracker.farm and use the code Ironclad to get a 15% discount on your first order. You will be very glad that you did. Firecracker.farm. Yeah, I have to agree with you. It's really hard to speculate because, the designation came out and it's not like a light switch occurred and all of a sudden, like you said, so many people focus on, oh, it's going to be Predator drones and Reaper drones and we're just going to be dropping bombs. And I mean, maybe that will happen. I think if it does, it'll be to a very, very, very small degree in certain situations. Is it going to be long-term training and collaboration and going back to sending, American military to train and assist or advise through the government military? Is it going to change, like you said, the money? I mean, it has cascading consequences north of the border too. I know there's issues with, I think, what do they call it? The Iron River of, straw purchased weapons traveling south. Well, man, if you can now put a terrorism charge on the person, a material aid to a terrorist organization for somebody making a straw purchase or somebody driving a vehicle. I mean, it remains to be seen because not a lot of action has been taken since then. But I'm very curious to see where it goes if it's just an intelligence sharing perspective, if it's a tactical perspective, a combination of the two. I think you're correct to not hypothesize because there's just too many variables that are up in the air right now.
100%. And I actually disagree that not enough action has happened because, well, because I cover this, it seems like there's fucking action every day.
Probably because there is.
There is. I mean,
Yeah.
just this week, like Mexico extradited the most amount of people in a single day to the
I was
United
going to
States.
ask you about that too. Yeah, 27 people. What are your thoughts on that? Why did they choose that time to do it?
29, and I think it was to
Oh,
avoid
yeah.
tariffs. Yeah. And I mean, them extraditing Rafael Caro Quintero, who they say is responsible, for the murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985. That was very significant because there has been a push from the US for years to take him to face justice in the United States.
Mhm.
And he's been able to evade that entirely until now. And I think this really was to avoid tariffs. I mean, Mexico has done, I criticize the Mexican government, I criticize the American, but I think Mexico has done a lot to fulfill what Trump asked them, which was crack down on the border, crack down on fentanyls, and crack down on illegal migrants. So they sent troops to the border. I mean, in February alone was like the lowest amount of illegal migrant crossings we've seen in like at least 25 years,
Yeah,
which is
shocking.
very significant. Yes, of course. And then I think like was the lowest day ever was like 200 crossings in a day that were seen by Border Patrol agents. And they say that fentanyl trafficking across the border has gone down. And then the Mexican president even bypasses sort of legal jurisdiction to send these 29 guys who are probably some of the most notoriously evil and powerful men in Mexican cartel history. Now they are facing justice in the United States. That's so incredibly significant. And then tariffs still happened, which makes me wonder what is going to be the Mexican government's incentive to keep putting resources and money into this crackdown that Trump has pushed so hard for, if at the end of the day, he still did exactly what he said he wasn't going to do.
Yeah, and this is where my limit of knowledge of geopolitics, we've reached it. I don't know what it's going to look like with the tariffs, the impact on both sides. It's easy for people in elected office to talk about these sweeping changes when they probably as an individual are not the ones who are going to be feeling the impact of these things. Much like you said, the cartel bosses, we're just going to wait this one out.
Yeah.
It's the people in the middle. It's the Oreo, the delicious center of the Oreo that's getting smashed from both sides. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know what it would take for him to reverse those tariffs. I mean, a lot of people, a Western approach, meaning, I guess, American. I was going to say North American, but I'll stay inside of our own borders.
Mexico's in North America. Yeah.
I was going to say I'll stay inside of our own borders, right? Because I don't want to speak for Canada either. We have, tariffs on the north side of that border as well. A lot of people voice that they think that Mexico should just handle this issue on their own. And I'm curious if you think that that's even possible. If the
don't.
Yeah, I was going to say, if the Mexican government said, here's our role going forward, we're going to smash these cartels, do you think it's even possible?
No, because it's a matter of resources and it's a matter of ensuring that the people in charge of doing that are not corrupt, which we know a lot of them are. I mean, a few of us journalists on this beat have been told by our sources that Mexico is also planning to hand over some political figures on corruption charges to be tried in the United States, which
Really?
I think is going to, yes, and that's very significant because in order to even crack down on organized crime, the people who are there meant to, serve and protect the public, they can't be a part of it. That it completely defeats the purpose. And there are a lot of significant figures who have historically profited off of cartels and organized crime, and a lot who continue to do so. So in order for Mexico to solve this problem or really crack down on cartels, they need to clean the whole house, get rid of the rotten apples. And there also needs to be enough resources. And then this also comes back to tariffs. I don't want to like push this too hard, but uh, the tariffs could likely push the Mexican economy into a recession. And if that happens, how the fuck do you expect them to continue to put resources and money into cracking down on the cartels if it's already limited? I mean, it defeats the whole purpose. So this is a really multifaceted problem, and I don't think Mexico could do it on their own. Here's the thing. I think Mexico, if there were less corrupt officials and there was an across the board mentality of we're going to end this, 100% Mexico could do it. Okay? No doubt. But we're not there yet. There's too much corruption. And also, the previous administration, the previous president, had this abrazos no balazos policy, which was hugs not bullets policy. And I feel like that allowed during his administration for the cartels to really thrive. And they got to a point where they became so strong that now for this new president to come in, she came into power in October. Mm-hmm. So not long to come in and like overhaul this. It almost was like he was like, here's a shit pie, like
yeah.
turn it into like
here you go. Have a nice shit sandwich. Let me know when you get to the end of it.
Yeah, literally. And the thing is, from the looks of it, it seems like the Mexican government is trying to crack down. I'm not entirely sure if that's whether by their own volition or because Trump is putting pressure. But it's going to be harder for her than if they tried to do this 10 years ago, honestly.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if you don't, I mean, it's, I don't know if an infection is the greatest analogy or metaphor.
It is.
The longer you let it go, the harder it is, even if you go to world-class medical practitioners. First, they have to stop it. Then they incrementally have to fight their way backwards. And it's going to take at least as long, if not longer, to regain territory than it was for you to have it taken from you. It's a long process.
And if I could continue on with this metaphor, please. It's almost as if like, okay, you're treating the infection right now, you're taking the antibiotics, but then you have the infected, let's say like a nail, like a screw, is still in there, right? Like it's still in the infection. It's at the wound site. So if you can treat it as much as you want, you can extradite these guys, you can send troops, but if you still have those infectors in there, how are the antibodies going to fight it off? And I kind of refer to that in the sense of the corrupt politicians, the people in power who continue to move freely with impunity and profit off of organized crime.
Yeah, no, it's a complicated issue for sure. I think a very traditional American view of the cartel, I think for the average person, and I'm going to put myself in this category for a long time. It was not something that I looked into deeply because, quite frankly, I didn't have the ability to have conversations with somebody like yourself who is entrenched in this. You're going to hear about violence. You're going to hear about pretty grotesque displays of violence for their intended purpose, to intimidate people. You hear a lot about drug smuggling and trafficking, human smuggling and trafficking at the border. But I feel like that is just a wave top. If you could take as much time as you want from somebody who has been living amongst this and talking with people who are in this world, can you give an actual size, scope, and scale of these organizations and talk about how it's not just, yes, there is the violence. Yes, they are involved in human trafficking and drug smuggling and all that, but just how far their tentacles actually reach out, because it is far more than that. And for people who don't have the chance for these conversations, they hit the wave tops and they think because they only get the wave tops that it should be an easy solution. But I think once you explain how far and permeated their influence is, it breaks it down for people a little bit, the complexity.
Okay, so it's very deep rooted, right? And I mentioned how it's rooted within the government, mm-hmm. And then these cartels also are employing thousands of people internationally too, by the way, and have endless resources and money to continue moving this operation along. And then also, it's entrenched in the culture. So, our music and movies and celebrities down here um, sing and talk about and glamorize the narco cartel culture
Hmm.
and also become victim of it. I mean, just recently in Mazatlan, Sinaloa, Grupo Frontera, which is like a music group, was going to perform at the carnival there, and there's these things called narcomantas, which are basically like banners that have handwritten threats on them. Sorry, before they were about to perform, one of those banners showed up with a decapitated head on it saying, if Grupo Frontera performs, we'll kill everyone, including the guy who turns on the lights. So it
Whoa.
is so, yeah. Um, and this is something that's been going on for years. I mean, we could go back to when Chalino Sanchez was a very famous Mexican singer was assassinated after he performed, and there's this viral sort of video that's turned into a meme where as he's about to sing the song Alma Enamorada, someone hands him a note and he reads it and he's like sweating, and people assume that that was the threat of him either stop your performance or don't sing the song or you're dead. Well, but also the way that a lot of people are growing up is, my dad was in the cartel, my uncle, my older brothers, my neighbor. So what am I gonna do when I grow up? You think that kid's gonna decide to become a fucking dentist? No. So, and then also in a lot of smaller towns, perhaps, the cartel is also putting money into building those areas up, sort of like what Pablo Escobar did and why he was kind of referred to as Robin Hood. They're building schools, they're fixing up the hospitals, they're paying for certain kids' tuitions, they're paying for certain people's medical bills. In a way, they're doing charity for certain communities. And so when that's happening, it's really hard to convince these people who are already struggling financially to say, no, fuck these guys, they're the bad guys. How would you view them as the bad guys if, say, for example, this person just paid for your mom's cancer treatment? And so they have found ways to engrave themselves so and entrench themselves so deeply into Mexican communities, the culture, the government, politics, right? And so when that's the case, how do you go about dismantling organizations that are entrenched in every aspect of people's daily lives? Of course, there are a lot of people who do not fuck with the cartels and hate them. And, they live in Mexico and they say, we see so much violence, there's so much crime, we're tired of it. And
Mhm.
my son has been missing for the last 10 years and I don't know where he was. And he wasn't even involved in this because there's also a lot of cases of kidnapping people, it's mistaken identity, or murdering people. And what are the cartels they're going to do? They're sorry, uh, accident, you know? And so there's a lot of suffering, but then there is a lot of charity that's being done by these guys in certain areas. And that's, in my opinion, very hard to dismantle because when the community has your back, I mean, come on, there's been instances where the we can go back to the 2019 Culiacanazo in Culiacan when El Chapo Guzman's son was arrested, Ovidio, and the city broke out into war. There was shootouts between the police and the narcos and the public, and people were even backing up the narcos because at that time in Culiacan, the Chapitos were even doing what I'm saying. They were paying for people's education, paying their medical bills. And so then the government comes in and then war breaks out. It's such a convoluted topic because I don't know how you could end something that's so deeply entrenched. And I sort of compare it to like, gangster rap in the 90s where that was glamorized in California
Oh,
and
for sure.
the East Coast. But this is so much more beyond that just because they almost run a lot of the regions of Mexico as if they were the government. I mean, some people even say like the cartels are the Mexican government, and the Mexican government, it operates like a cartel because they profit off of allegedly profit off of the cartels. And then the cartels are running a lot of their regions that they have strongholds over like as if they are the government. So to really understand just how deeply entrenched the cartels are in Mexico and also internationally. I mean, even in Canada, a lot of my sources over there, um, they have ties with the cartels. The cartels are actively there, bringing in the precursors for fentanyl, producing it and trafficking it, employing, the straw buyers or traffickers. And so that kind of thing complicates it even more too, because when you have all these other countries and different nationalities, people who aren't Mexican, people who didn't grow up in cartel culture are now being employed by these very men. This is an international operation. And so for a lot of Americans, if they say, well, why don't we just go in there and just take them down? It's not. I get those comments all the time.
Well,
It's
that
not like
comment or
that.
question, I want to believe it comes from a good place, but I feel like that comment or question comes from somebody who they don't understand how the world works. They're looking for light switch solutions where you just hit one
Yeah,
thing and it changes. And the reality is it's more like a stereo equalizer, but there's 500 knobs and you have to move them all a little bit at a time because every time you move one, another one shifts. I wish it was a light switch solution. I really do, but
of course, I think most do.
yeah, it's anything but.
It really is. It's so hard to tackle it. And then, people ask me sometimes what do we need to do or what should be done? And I don't know because first of all, that's not my job. I'm not a political scientist. I just go and tell the stories and I gather information. Um, but also because every time there's a crackdown or they grab the big guy, someone else comes up out of the woodworks. I mean, right now something that we're not seeing as much, we're not talking about is the fact that the Sinaloa cartel, which has had a stronghold on Mexico for the longest time and has been a super powerful cartel, since the infighting began between the two factions of that cartel on September 9th, that cartel has been struggling. And there's another cartel called the Jalisco New Generation Cartel,
Yep.
which right now, is operating so under the radar that I mean, I give it 2 years, maybe max, and they're just going to be like the cartel
Really?
because, of course, because the Sinaloa cartel is failing. It's like a house of cards falling in on itself,
Hmm.
and everyone is focused on that. The American CIA planes are flying over Sinaloa, are gathering intel to capture these guys, but once you dismantle that cartel, and it's been dismantling over the past couple of months, CJNG, which is a very powerful cartel and notoriously very violent. I mean, we've seen violence, but then there is also a level of propaganda that makes people believe it's like very violent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they're they're right now probably laughing. I mean, the leader of the Jalisco cartel, El Mencho, on the same day that those 29 were extradited to the United States, his wife was released from jail. And it just makes me wonder and his brother, who was in jail, was not extradited. And it's like,
Hmm.
what's going on? This is going to be that next top dog of cartels in Mexico, in the United States and Canada too, actually. They're going to be the ones running it.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to get into elite shape, or perhaps just make improvements to your current level of fitness, check out the MTNTOUGH digital training program. You can try it for free for 14 days, and you can see the results for yourself. The app allows users to train wherever they are with minimal equipment requirements, whether you're in the gym or you're outdoors or you're at home. Users can access top-tier programming that fits into their lifestyle. The MTNTOUGH app offers expertly designed progressive training plans that guide users from start to finish. These plans are tailored to build resilience, strength, and endurance over time, preventing burnout and injury. The app features self-guided and follow-along coaching videos, allowing users to be coached through every workout step by step. This helps to ensure proper form, motivation, and intensity, regardless of the user's fitness level. The MTNTOUGH app delivers training programs built for the unique physical demands of mountain athletes, including hunters, tactical professionals, and outdoor adventurers. The programs themselves are designed by seasoned strength and conditioning experts, elite athletes, and military veterans. Start your 14-day free trial today and check out the results for yourself. And be sure to use the offer code CHANGEAGENTS, and I'm looking at it as one word, at signup, and you can get 40% off your annual subscription. Remember, use the offer code CHANGEAGENTS at checkout. I want to talk about Canada and the other countries that you mentioned. I think it's very easy to view these organizations as brute force organizations. But what you're talking about is a spoke and hub model, which I'm going to assume the leadership is probably managing somewhere from Mexico, even though they'll have localized leadership. But it's much more in line with what you're talking about. It's a Fortune 500 model versus a corner thug influencing only through violence. I mean, how sophisticated are these cartels from maybe, let's say, a business model, their ability to communicate internationally? Because even what you said, there's certainly cartel influence, even where I live. So I'm 60 miles from the Albertan border up in Canada. There is cartel influence here for sure. Most of the time, and this is from talking with my law enforcement friends, the drug routes will come up the West Coast and they will make their way eastward, usually from Spokane. I think that's a source city for where I live. And there is cartel influence, and they are tracking the cartel as they are moving that through. But then you're talking north of the border in Canada as well, which I would imagine, or maybe you would know. Are they coming through the U.S. to manage their business in Canada, or are they just going direct and around the U.S. to do so? Which again just speaks to their level of that complexity and sophistication. It's not a thug organization, even though there are definitely thugs involved with it. This is high-level sophistication.
It is. And they're getting into Canada both ways. Like they'll go from the United States, but a lot of them will just fly directly in. And also for the longest time, it was very simple because Canada, unlike the United States, didn't have a visa requirement for Mexican travelers. That's something that just came into place recently. I think a year ago, maybe two. Don't quote me on that, but it's very recent. And so during that time, especially during Trump's first administration, when he was really cracking down on that southern border, your guys' northern border became very weakened because the cartels thought, all right.
People don't want to know how few Border Patrol agents are patrolling the northern border in comparison to the southern. Let's just say there's a few more gaps.
Yeah, and I talk about this all the time because I'm Canadian and I covered crime in Canada, and people are like, that's bullshit. Less than 1% of fentanyl comes into the United States from Canada. And I'm just like, that's kind of delusional, honestly, because like I have a lot of really good sources in crime over there and in law enforcement because that's the hometown, the homeland. And so that
less than 1% is seized at the border, which I don't know if that's reflective of what's. I mean, again, I have Border Patrol friends, and a lot of the times they're out there responding to cameras or sensors, but they don't have the manpower to get out there in real time. And what do they see? People moving through with backpacks, people doing vehicle exchanges right at the border. I'm not going to hypothesize what's in there, but I think what's seized at the border versus what's traveling through the border, two very different numbers.
And also it's important to keep in mind that the Canadian-US border, there's like a lot of unprotected area, it's just a lot of forest.
There's like a tree that's leaning from the US into Canada, and that's it. There's no border wall up in the northern border. We have the Great Lakes area, but you can walk around those. Not that I'm giving anybody ideas. It is far less patrolled and far more porous than the southern border. That's just the reality of the topography.
And also because I think there was so much focus on fentanyl is coming from Mexico and the cartels are Mexican, that it shifted the focus and kind of allowed them to get over there and start operations and maintain operations really under the radar. Yeah. And, in Canada, of course, we have our gangs who a lot of them now have partnered up with the Mexican cartels. So one of my law enforcement border sources in Canada told me that a lot of the older, I've spoken about this before, I spoke about it on Borderland, is that a lot of the older Indian men, like South Asian men in Canada, who for the longest time operated the organized crime over there, have now joined forces with the cartels, the presence that exists in Canada, to run the drug trade. And that's very interesting because, typically in Canadian crime history, uh, Mexico existed, but I don't think their presence, the cartel presence, was as significant as it is now.
Hmm.
And I think that's grown since really started to see a change, I would say, from 2016 until now. So I guess almost a decade. Wow, that's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And
Organizations
imagine,
respond to pressure, whether they are above board or below board. I mean, we found this when we were chasing down terrorist organizations overseas. They respond to our tactics, they respond to pressure. It's move, counter move. So it doesn't surprise me at all that a presence shifted, especially if the focus, like, let's go 99 out of 100 spotlights on the southern border, and then we'll have this random light up on the northern border just sweeping back and forth. And maybe it catches something, maybe not. I mean, as an organization, you're going to look at that. You're going to respond to that. It doesn't surprise me at all.
and prior to Trump doing that sort of like crackdown with the border crackdowns, with the tariff threats, well, now no longer a threat,
Yeah.
um, there the amount of fentanyl that was being seized, or the press releases that I was getting from RCMP in Canada, it was very insignificant. And so this summer, I went back to Canada and I had a source from the cartel operating on the West Coast in Canada tell me just exactly how they're producing and trafficking fentanyl. I did this story. I reached out to law enforcement, and keeping in mind law enforcement in Canada too, especially when you're a journalist, a lot of the agencies, it is just like pulling teeth.
Mm.
And yeah, I'll say that on a public forum because fuck, you guys do not make it easy. Um, God, sometimes I would lose my mind. Um, and so I was reaching out and I was like, "Hey, can we talk about this? Can I get some sort of confirmation? Like, what do you guys know about the presence of Mexican cartels here and their presence in producing fentanyl and working with the brothers keepers and the people from Iran that are here running the drug trade, and that have ties to Hezbollah? And I want to know it all. Let's talk about it." Katarina, if you think this is happening, you're delusional. They basically laughed in my face.
Really?
Okay. Yeah. And now, almost, I'd say like twice a week, it's like there's a press release, biggest fentanyl seizure to date in Canada and at the border. And this massive trap house we cracked
Yeah.
down on it and all these guys were arrested. And I go, oh, so fuck, they just showed up out of nowhere, right? But it's a matter of resources and it's a matter of what their focus was on. And I want to say maybe I'm just being an asshole, but I just don't think they wanted to even accept it because maybe it was just too much work. And it really honestly, like on a human level, upsets me because there have been so many fentanyl overdose deaths in Canada.
Yeah.
Like, especially Alberta was ground zero during COVID. I don't know if you remember this, but it was like they literally declared a public emergency, a crisis, because so many people were dying. And,
I did not
it's
know
even,
that.
yeah, it was ground zero for the fentanyl overdose crisis. And then during COVID, more people in Canada were dying from fentanyl than from COVID-19. There was every week there would be the public health officer would put on a press conference to talk about, what are the new like rules and how many people died in COVID or how many people are infected, la la la. And then she'd move on to the fentanyl overdose numbers because that was a crisis at the same time. And it just didn't match. Like the
Yeah.
numbers of people dying from fentanyl was insane. So the fact that that was happening, I mean, you had to be a fucking like clueless to think that fentanyl wasn't being produced in Canada to result in such a high level of deaths, especially during COVID, where like there wasn't any movement. So where was that fentanyl coming from? From your backyard. And so many people were dying, so many new people were becoming addicted to it. It's a highly toxic drug. It's highly addictive. And now all of a sudden, since Trump started putting this pressure to crack down on the border, we're seeing fentanyl bust after seizure after bust after seizure. And it's like this has been happening.
Yeah.
And also something that the Canadian police do all the time. Oh, I'm gonna get so much shit for this. But
Tell me more.
Something that I notice the Canadian police do a lot is when there is this sort of large fentanyl seizure in the press release, they're saying this is worth X amount of money on the streets, and it's so blown out of proportion. It's like just say how much those 129,000 fentanyl pills are actually worth, okay? It's not about making it look like you guys don't flex your muscles. This is killing people. So
Yeah.
let's keep it real here. But yeah, Canada was for a long time Alberta ground zero for the fentanyl overdose death crisis.
Ironclad creates premium content no matter the environment. From extreme elements to unforgiving terrain, we thrive on crafting content that captures the essence of your brand in the most challenging conditions. Bring your brand story to life, ensuring your message leaves an impact. Ready to elevate your vision? Connect with us today at ironcladagency.com.
So I used to live in San Diego, where I lived, and specifically, I used to professionally skydive. And the airport we would take off from was over by was by a reservoir, and on the flight path we would literally follow the border out towards the water and then come back. So I could see from my house the southern border. You'd hear all the time about seizures, but they would also follow up those massive seizures. Any news organization worth their salt would talk about that whatever you're capturing at the border is just rough back of the envelope map, microscopic, or back of the envelope math, not map, is a microscopic fraction of what is actually being successfully passed.
Yeah, tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, so the Canadian government, it's great, and I applaud their efforts to be doing more of these seizures. But let's not pretend like that's actually shutting the spigot off. I'm going to just say that it's probably the same thing reflective of the southern border. You're catching what you catch. You have no idea the size, scope, and scale of what's actually making it through. Because if it's anything like the southern border, you're catching 1% if you're lucky.
100%. And keeping in mind that these precursors are coming straight into the Port of Vancouver. It's coming in on the West Coast from China. And so, it makes it very easy for them to make it over there. And when I was doing this story in the summer, I said, the Mexican cartels are here, and I'm talking to the law enforcement guys, and I'm like, can I get something, anything? And they're like, no, whatever, it's not happening, and it's not that deep. And then I went to the lab.
Yeah.
And you got Mexicans cooking there, and then they're telling me that Chinese guys came in from China and taught them how to cook and then went back.
Well, I guess if you ignore something long enough, you'll have to eventually deal with it. I don't know if that's a great strategy for life. No, if you
ignore something long enough, it will just go away. Out of sight, out of mind.
I wish there was any evidence for that to be the case in any sector of life. Because every time I've tried that, it's come back to bite me 100% of the time.
and that's literally what's happening now, I think. And I think even Trump's pressures on the whole fentanyl. I mean, originally he made it seem like he was trying to crack down on fentanyl because they were losing hundreds of thousands of American lives. We now know that clearly that's not the case, which is unfortunate because I think that the fentanyl epidemic is very tragic. A lot of people have lost loved ones. A lot of people have lost their lives. A lot of young people. It's really shitty. And even if they haven't died, you see people who are on fentanyl. They look like they're dying. They look like shit.
They do.
And it's so sad.
They look like the Walking Dead.
It's horrible. I mean, you completely lose your quality of life. And so, and initially when he was doing that, I thought, okay, this is like a tough crackdown. And I think a lot of people felt the same way. Clearly, I don't really think he actually gave that much of a fuck about it because that was the whole incentive for the tariffs. And then the tariffs still came into place, even though we're going to find out soon just about fentanyl numbers. I'm expecting to maybe this week or next week. And I'm really curious to see what that's going to be. How much fentanyl was seized at the border? What is the ratio difference? What were the fentanyl overdose deaths like in the United States this past month? I'm really curious to see because I would like to see if these border crackdowns on Canada's side and on Mexico's side, how they impacted that within the United States, actually.
I think it'll take a little bit of time. I mean, I have no idea what level of supply exists in the U.S. at any given time, but the crackdown would have to be pretty significant for them to work through those reserves, strategic reserves, I guess would be a good term.
Right.
I think at some point, though, you'd get a good assessment of it. Question for you, something that hit me, I was reading this morning. What are your thoughts on the Mexican government suing Smith and Wesson, saying that they are essentially complicit in arming the cartels?
Yeah, they've done this before. They sued American gun manufacturers before, and then the case was dismissed in the
Mm-hmm.
United States. I think this is exactly what's going to happen again. Uh, 70% or more than 70% of guns that are seized at Mexican crime scenes are American made. They're coming from the United States. And in Mexico, it's illegal to carry a firearm.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that they're getting these guns and they're getting them from the United States, and as we talked about, through straw buyers. I mean, this guy was just arrested. I tweeted about it with a shit ton of arms trying to cross into Tijuana from San Diego. I think that this case again is going to fall flat, but I also, maybe I didn't see myself saying this, but the Mexican president yesterday, when she spoke out responding to tariffs, she said both countries need to accept responsibility for allowing these cartels to thrive, in so few words. Okay, that's definitely not exactly what she said. And certainly when she was referring to that, she's talking about the rate of consumption of fentanyl in the United States, but she's also talking about the gun trafficking from the United States
Mm-hmm.
into Mexico. And I think it's a major problem. Of course, however, when these straw buyers are trafficking arms into Mexico, that's on Mexican authorities at the border to check out, right? But at the same time, if Mexican gun stores and manufacturers are profiting off of these arms sales that are arming the cartels and keeping them dangerous, there is certainly a level of responsibility. I'm not the morality police here, okay? It's just I'm trying to look at this from an objective point of view. If this product, these goods are arming an organization that is very violent, something needs to be done there. I'm not entirely sure if suing the gun manufacturer is the right way to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know what the right way to go about it would be. All I know are the facts, and the facts are that most of the arms here, even when I go and interview these cartel members, and I could pull up a picture right now from, I think the brand was called Creed Suspension, I want to say.
Hmm.
That most of their guns are American made. Actually, like almost all their guns are American made.
Yeah.
And that's very significant. And those guns are responsible for very violent crimes.
I don't
know.
I think it's a fair statement to say that both sides of the border could tidy up their house a little bit. I don't think it's fair to point 100% in either direction. I land on suing the gun manufacturer is an interesting move, and I think legally it will fail. Otherwise, Otherwise, alcohol,
it already has.
Yeah, alcohol manufacturers would be sued when somebody gets a DUI. However, I have talked to enough people now in this world that they are clearly aware of particular FFL or firearms dealers in certain states that turn a blind eye. And those are things that the wrench can be applied to those things and hopefully stymie or stem the flow south. So yeah, we can always do a better job. We can always tidy up our house before pointing fingers externally as well.
So that's the thing too, and that's why I was saying, like, I don't know if suing them is the right thing, but they're also profiting.
Yeah.
Is like there are certainly some figures who know that they're profiting, legitimate.
Yep.
They know they're profiting illegitimately off of this. They know their guns are ending up in the hands of the cartel. Of course, that's wrong. But I don't know, and coming from Canada, it's hard for me to talk about gun laws or what's right and wrong in the United States, just because I grew up in Canadian gun culture is very different from American gun culture,
for sure.
as is Mexican gun culture. So,
yeah. Well, we got enough guns for both of you. I think we're at 370 million in circulation.
it's a lot.
It is a lot. And people say, yeah, we should just take them away. I'm like, man, that's a light switch solution if I've ever heard one. I would love to know the mechanism where you think that's going to actually happen. Let alone I disagree with that concept, but man, that's a episode in and of itself. I want to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate your insight. What do you want to leave the listeners with?
I mean, there's a lot going on right now, but my go-to answer is just to have some humanity, because a lot of people are affected by a lot of these political policies and by the organized crime. So it's really easy to really point fingers at anyone or talk a lot of shit, but at the end of the day, a lot of regular civilians' everyday lives are severely impacted by these very decisions and by organized crime. And it's always important to keep that in mind, and I think a lot of your viewers, I think most of them are American, and, saying like the drone strike in Mexico and stuff like that, it's really important to keep in mind there are a lot of really good, honest, hardworking people that are affected by organized crime, that are affected by these policies, that if it were to come to war, that their lives would go to shit. And it's important to remember that. And a lot of people can't afford to lose more than they already have.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. Kat, I can't thank you enough for your time, and promise me you'll stay as safe as possible out there.
I try my best, Andy. I really do.
Noticed I didn't say stay safe. I said stay as safe as possible.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, there's
Of
risk
course.
involved with what you do, but there's importance in what you do as well. And honestly, at this point in my life, I've realized that if there's not at least a little bit of risk involved, what you're doing may not be that meaningful.
100%. And I think about that a lot of time too, because especially sometimes if I'll just like meet people, what do you do, Katarina? I'm a teacher, something like that, because it's a lot to get into. But I think that when you're doing something that is really important, there has to be sometimes a little bit of risk, and I'm willing to take that risk if it means that other people can feel like their voices are being heard and their stories are being told.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you would like to learn more about Katarina's work or follow her, please click the link in the show notes, which is going to take you directly to her Substack. Thank you again for listening to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. See you all next week with an all-new episode and an all-new guest.